Rob Barker as he takes you into some time-critical management.
All right. How's everybody doing? We staying awake? Mostly? All right. I'll try to talk loud and see if I can keep everybody going here. So, appreciate everybody's time. We're going to talk about a couple of things over the next 2 hours or so here. First, we're going to start with a deep dive on the time-critical management pieces here. So I'll kind of walk you through how that process works. We'll talk about some of the setup pieces and hopefully answer any outstanding questions you may have there. After we finish that up, we'll move into the quarantining feature with ITMS and SEP. So we'll kind of walk through that process as well, look at the different setup pieces, and kind of talk about what happens and how those little things work. And then we'll wrap it up with the integration between Control Compliance Suite Vulnerability Manager, which is the CCS VM product, and the IT Management Suite component, okay? If you have any questions or anything, please just feel free to interrupt me and we'll get them taken care of for you, all right? So that being said, let's dive in and talk about TCM here. So, a couple of things. Damon mentioned this when we were doing the webcast a little bit earlier here. The management platform that we have is obviously very scalable. We have a number of customers that have upwards of several 100,000 managed endpoints within their system. We have distributed architecture with our site servers. We have package servers. All these distribution points that are available and allow us to really kind of spread out very evenly and scale in customer environments. One of the reasons we're able to do that, though, is because we don't really do anything in real time, right? And that's for good reason. We have this policy-based approach. The endpoints have the ability to kind of check back in. They check in. Some of that's even randomized. Even when you do something kind of quote-unquote right now, there's still a bit of randomization that occurs. And to be quite frank, 95% of the time, that's the right way to do that, right? This concept of doing things instantaneously is great, but it does create a little bit of overhead, right? That being said, there are some legitimate reasons why you want and or need to be able to do things in real time. So when you talk about things like security use cases, viral outbreaks, things of that nature there, any kind of immediate remediation. Another one that's not security related at all is something like an audit, right? Which we all know never happens, right? Nobody ever gets audited, for anything like that. So, again, going back to that need to be able to do something right away, there's a valid reason for that. So that being said, we needed to build an infrastructure, if you will, that would allow us to kind of reach out and touch these endpoints immediately as is appropriate, right? One of the challenges, or several of the challenges we ran into, as I mentioned, right, there's some latency that occurs with the way the current architecture is set up. So, that policy-based approach, right, takes some time there. The task server is another major kind of roadblock, if you will, right? The way the task server was designed in the beginning was to manage those tasks and execute them, right? It wasn't necessarily concerned with the amount of overhead or the nature in which it reached out and grabbed those endpoints there. We do have the tickle service, if you will, that has the ability to kind of do a force connection there. But even that infrastructure is not available over the cloud-enabled management connections, right? Which is something that has been a bit of a problem for us there, okay? And then, of course, none of these connections are persistent, right? So they're not really bidirectional. It's more of a push-pull, set-and-forget type approach, right? Those types of things there. So in order to facilitate that, we created this time-critical management infrastructure, if you will. And within that blanket, we are creating a subset of features, if you will. The first one that would be that is released and is available now is the on-demand inventory piece, which is what we're going to talk about today inside of TCM there, okay? So let's talk architecturally here. Obviously, the current setup, if you will, and I say current with air quotes, if you will, is this policy-based approach, right? The clients check in, they get a policy from the notification server, and it takes some time. Client has to initiate that, and there is a little bit of overhead, to be honest with you, with the way that actually behaves. So the protocols, communication protocols that the clients use, there's a little bit of effort required in building that out, okay? The way we've done it now, though, is we've implemented a technology called WebSockets. If you're not familiar with that, a WebSocket is something that's an open standard, right? It exists. There's an IRC for it, that's out there right now. A lot of different companies and vendors take advantage of that style technology. But WebSockets are essentially bidirectional SSL ports that can be opened between anything, right? An endpoint and a service, if you will, okay? The key there is that A, it's bidirectional, B, it's part of that, it's an SSL connection, right? So it's encrypted, it's secure, and it has very low overhead, right? That's the advantage to this thing. So when we talk about saying, say there's 100,000 systems, right, all docked with a WebSocket connection, you're only talking a few K per connection, right? So if you remember back in the deployment solution 6-9 days, or even the current GSS 3X model, GSS has that ability to have that persistent connection, right? Everybody loved that. The reason, though, you can only have, maybe 3,000 to 5,000 connections on that server there is because each one of those connections had some serious overhead involved in doing that, right? And so, even though we're going to talk a little bit about how that connection is very similar to this WebSocket technology, I want you to understand that they're very different, right? This is not a port over of that DS and GSS technology into the ITMS world. It's actually a reimagining of how that connection could occur, if that makes sense, okay? So from a connection point of view, the notification server itself will open up a WebSocket to the clients themselves. That is an always connected approach, right? So that's something the clients effectively dock to, is how that works. The best way to kind of describe that, right? We talked earlier about whether or not that's something the server initiates or the client initiates. The client does initiate that originally. So the communication profile is set up on the notification server. When those clients connect into that notification server, they get the quote unquote policy, if you will, that tells them that it's okay to use a WebSocket connection. They will then attempt to dock. Once they're docked, they now have a persistent connection, and we're going back and forth at that point. That makes sense, okay? Now, as far as the way the rest of these operate, right, and again, that's an immediate, persistent, very low overhead, like I mentioned, right? We also have a WebSocket connection that goes to the Cloud-Enabled Management Gateway, right? So that's another tunnel we're able to open. We've also got a WebSocket connection that goes from the gateway out to the clients that are across the internet there as well. So you can actually dock an internet-connected client to a gateway and actually manage it instantaneously over the internet there, right? The only latency you're going to run into or concerns you may have are actual bandwidth problems at that point, right? So obviously a 56K connection is going to run into a couple of concerns, right? Versus something like, a broadband connection or what have you there, right? Okay. Additionally, if I did this the right way, we've got a WebSocket connection down to the task server or to the site servers, if you will. So there's a WebSocket connection going on there, right? It's like an episode of Oprah. Everybody gets a WebSocket, right? WebSockets go from the task server to the SEM gateway as well. This is really just kind of a mesh setup that we're doing here, okay? Now, any questions on that before I actually jump in and show you the meat of this thing here? When you say no gateway, what are you asking? Oh, for the WebSocket pieces? No, so in this particular situation, if you wanted to deploy the Cloud-Enabled Management Gateway to manage folks outside of the local net or of the LAN there, then yes, there would be a gateway. If you have no need for that or you're not ready to set that up yet, the WebSocket technology is in no way connected to that gateway setup at all. So it's not a requirement, if that makes sense. Yeah. Is that running as standalone then? The WebSocket connection itself, yes. It is. So, yeah, so the question was whether or not the WebSocket itself is running as a kind of a separate service, if you will. And the answer to that is yes. So later on, I'll talk a little bit about some of the components. There were some changes we made to the agent itself to kind of support that process functionality, if you will. Additionally, on the server, there is a service, if you will, a microservice that is managing that docking process as well and kind of keeping track of those connections there. Yeah.
Even though you said it's low overhead, are there more? Even though you said it's low overhead, are there more requirements for power on the servers?
There are not. So, hopefully everybody heard that. Low overhead. Is there more hardware, if you will? Do you require more resources, if you will, on the management platform in order to support these? The answer to that is no. In fact, we're still kind of in the infant stages of playing the testing games and what have you there, but you actually need less resources in order to connect those WebSocket connections. They're actually less overhead than the native agent-based communication that we have, typically out of the box, if you will. So theoretically, the scalability numbers could actually go up. We've tested upwards of 50,000 active WebSocket connections on a single notification server. Barely hit it at all. Okay. All right. Anybody else? Before we jump forward? Okay. Oh, yeah. No, you're fine.
Thanks. Okay, so in the scenario of the corporate-owned non-VPN-based clients, on their side, if I was using this method, would they see increased usage of data, like if they're all on like mobile hotspots?
Sure. No, that's a great question. So the answer to that is actually no. The WebSocket connection does not require, there is a keep alive there, right? But it's not the same kind of ping setup, if you will, that normally the agent itself would actually use right now. Generally speaking, if you weren't running any tasks, if you weren't delivering any payloads, you would see minimal overhead, just enough to make sure that that WebSocket connection is still alive. There is a keep alive, a heartbeat, if you will, that goes back and forth there. So that should be minimal as far as that's concerned. Nobody should notice that.
Is it increased though, or is it?
No, it does not increase. In fact, it should be a little bit less. I don't have the exact numbers for you, but that's something we can look into there to be
Is
sure.
that something that we could get data back on?
As far as like from a reporting perspective in the
Yes.
console itself, you know, I don't know if we actually have that information. We keep track of the connections themselves, so we do have a report that tells you that. I don't know if we have a report that actually outlines what data, the amount of data or volume of data, if you will, it's coming across that WebSocket connection. It's something we track on the peer-to-peer side, but we'll make a note of that and we can look into that. In fact, if somebody, Damon or Tomas, if you could just write that down for us, we'll take a look for you, for sure. That's actually a really good question, especially the metered connections there. Okay, so let's jump in and actually take a look at how this beast operates here. So, you get out of this, we'll switch gears over to the SMP. Okay, so the WebSocket connection needs to be enabled in 3 different places, okay, in order for it to function correctly here. So the first place we're actually going to go to is settings. We're going to hit over the notification server. We're going to go to notification server settings. And there is a policy right here for time critical management and persistent connections, okay? Everybody needs to understand that in 8.5, whether you upgrade, whether you do a net new install, it doesn't matter. This is disabled by default, okay? We did that on purpose. We think this is a much better technology and a much better approach for everybody to use. We don't want to force feed it on you, so make sure if this is something you want to take advantage of, go turn that on, right? So this first setting that we're looking at right here is essentially telling the notification server, you're okay to use a WebSocket, go ahead and configure the communication policies at this point. Make sense? Okay. The next 2 places we're going to take a look at here. The first one is the actual agent side itself. So if we go to the agents and plugins section here, and we look at the communication profile, which is what I'm looking at here right now on the screen, you can see that there is a section right here for persistent connections, right? This is as simple as editing this, turning it on, and now you've set up WebSockets, right? It's really that simple, okay? Time critical management has some options available to you, right? You know, how often do you want the persistent connection to time out, right? You know, all this other, you know, little keep alives and things like that, right? You can tweak these if you need to. Most folks will find that this is perfectly acceptable. Anybody on a low latency network, right, might need to play with these numbers a little bit, you know, just to kind of keep things, as efficient as possible, right? But essentially that's it. It's on and ready to go. The caveat here that I did forget to mention, because this is an SSL connection, obviously SSL needs to be set up in the environment, right? So your notification server should be communicating with HTTPS. Hopefully all of you are at that point by now. We did run into some, I don't want to say problems necessarily, but we had to go do some kind of back converting, if you will, and get a couple of customers from HTTP and get HTTPS set up properly for them in order to make sure this was up and running and ready to go. Not a big deal. We've made that process a lot easier to handle there. Certificates are always the part that's a little kludgy, right, for most people to kind of deal with there. So if you have any questions on that, Tomas is the guy to call. I'm just kidding. We have white papers and all kinds of stuff that can help you with that. Yeah, question in the back. Both of them can. So the question was whether or not HTTP and HTTPS could be enabled. The answer to that is yes. But obviously, if HTTPS is not available, then the WebSocket connection wouldn't function, and the agent will just fall back to standard communication at that point. Yeah, great question. Okay. All right. The next thing we're going to look at is the site servers here. This is the last place you actually need to get this configured. So we'll go notification server and we'll go to site server settings. You can do this individually if you choose to. Each site server has its own policy that's available to it. So for some reason you only wanted to turn on this functionality for a particular subnet or a particular site or set of sites, that's something you could do. In this case, I'm just going to grab the actual global policy right here, and you can see this one has a persistent connection as well. As soon as you turn that on, you're good to go. Okay. There are some questions around, what are the ramifications, for example, if I turn it on with the agents, but not the, task services and what have you. Everything will still work, right? You'll just kind of run into some inconsistencies, right? Anything coming from the notification server would obviously, function over that SSL connection, that WebSocket connection just fine. You'd still get the ability to do the real-time style inventory and things like that. But there are certain things that we'll talk about here in a few minutes, like pushing tasks and stuff like that, that would struggle to, kind of keep up with that process if you forget to do that on the site servers there. Okay? All right. Last caveat on this, WebSockets are native to server 2012, 2016. I got to double check on 2008, but I want to say the answer to that is no, as far as natively being available in IIS here. I've got some information on the next couple of slides that we'll get into after the demo's done there. Okay? Any other questions on that? Okay. So let's jump in and actually look at now the product itself, right? So time critical management is built on top of the workspaces, the ITMS workspaces UI, if you will, right? So it's something that it's a separate console. It can be scoped separately. So if you want your security response team to have access to this and no one else, you can go ahead and do that. If you want to keep this limited to just certain administrators, you can go ahead and do that as well. There are obviously certain people have some concerns about saying I don't want somebody to run an inventory update, for example, on 250,000 machines live, right? That could potentially cause some problems on the network, right? So you can set up all that role and scope controls just like you would with any other piece of software there. So if I go to home, I click on time critical management, this will go ahead and launch for me, right? And I'm in the TCM interface now and I'm ready to go. What's really cool about this though, and this kind of steals some thunder from the workspaces a little bit, is this thing is browser agnostic now. So I'm actually opening up Chrome and you can see I'm running time critical management in here. So that new workspaces interface will run on anything. Technically, you could actually open this on an iPad and it would run just fine at that point, right? So keep that in mind as we go through this. I'll be playing with the Chrome interface and go from there, okay? On the TCM side, you have a couple of options here that are available to you, okay? Now keep in mind the original kind of goal with this, if you will, at least for the V1 installation, is on-demand inventory. So we're looking for something, right? I need to know, I need to find something in order to do something, right? Whether, like I said, there's an audit, there's some kind of viral outbreak, threat, whatever that may be, I need to start somewhere. So we've broken this out into a couple of places. You can search for hardware. So if I look for something like VMware, for example, type this in, I can see what kind of information pops back. On the right-hand side, you'll notice there's a count available to me so I can see how many physical resources match that particular line item. So if I wanted to drill into this 3D graphics adapter, for example, you can actually see who is a member of that particular line item right there, right? And it's as simple as me either individually selecting these if that's something I wanted to go ahead and do, or cancel out of this, I can select the actual line items themselves and they become part of my scope, if you will, as far as that's concerned, okay? The other options you have right here from this search is you can actually look at the core scope itself. So right now, by default, I'm actually looking in all computers. That's where my starting scope is. If for some reason you wanted to narrow this down to, finance or a subnet or all Windows 10 machines, whatever, right? Whatever that particular top level scope is, you can go ahead and start there and then move down, okay? As I mentioned, the role and scope-based security applies here as well. So if somebody's only able to see, devices, for example, in the Denver office, then no matter what they do here, they will always be limited to that particular scope. Okay, so it is, it does behave well in that area. Okay, so we'll go ahead and cancel out of here. Got a few other options too. If I want to click out of this and I want to go into the software and patch side, I can look for something like in the demo we talked about Microsoft Office, for example. If I can learn how to type, that would help. And you can see I can do a search at that point, right? And it's bringing back all this data, okay? So let's talk for a quick second on what exactly is happening here. The beginning search that you're looking at right here, the first initial pass of data, if you will, is directly looking at the CMDB. This is not a real time. I'm not real time grabbing all these different clients right now and pulling data back, right? And there's a good reason for that. We spent a lot of time and energy and effort into making sure that CMDB is available, and a lot of times you have data ready to go, right? There's no need to go harass all these endpoints in the environment just to find out whether or not they have Office, okay? I can pull that data in and make it available to myself right away, right? That's an advantage we have of having that type of a system available to us. But that being said, let's go back to our, our WannaCry or even our audit example for a minute here. What if I'm looking for Microsoft Office because there's some vulnerability that exists out in the environment, okay? But I'm not sure who's installed Office, perhaps in the last 2 days, for example, right? Maybe somebody did, maybe somebody threw something on there, and this is a pretty critical vulnerability, so I need to know, with a high degree of certainty how accurate this is right now. Down below, and this is gonna be a little difficult to see on the projector here, but you can see inventory for 0 endpoints is out of 4 is older than 3 days. That's kind of my little breadcrumb trail there that I'm looking at right there, okay? This 3 days gives me the ability to click on it and say, well, you know what? That auditor or my security team says 3 days is too long, right? Especially in the case of something like a WannaCry outbreak, right? I need to know, now. So let me go ahead and change this to 6 hours. Well, you'll notice as soon as I change that, all of a sudden inventory for 4 endpoints out of 4 is older than 6 hours, right? So now now I know for a fact this data is not as fresh as I'd like it to be based on this particular set of search criteria that I'm looking for, right? So Maybe that's okay. Maybe I can change this, or I want to, customize that, make it an hour, whatever that number is. If we go back to our audit example, perhaps the auditor is at your door saying, hey, listen, if you can produce a report that tells me within the last, 24 hours, what your accuracy numbers are, then that'll be good enough for me. But if it's 2 or 3 weeks old, that's not, right? This is a way for you to kind of manipulate that information and get that going. Is that everybody with me so far? Okay, perfect. So now what we're going to do is we're going to actually push an update to these right now. So what I want to do is, before I even select any of these objects here, I need everybody to be current. So I'm going to go ahead and click update. Okay. You'll notice the screen's going to come up and say nobody, 0 endpoints in this case, are missing persistent connections. This is worded a little funny. We'll get that fixed here. But essentially what it's trying to tell you is, in your environment, say you have 1,000 machines, right? 800 of them have that persistent connection, so I can reach out and touch them right now. 200 do not. So keep in mind, as I run this process, those 200, I'm going to have to wait on them, right, until they check in. That's what this is trying to tell you right there. Okay? In this case, everybody's got a persistent connection, so I'm good to go. I'll go ahead and click OK. Screen's going to change on me right here, and we've got this beautiful thing called a progress bar that'll actually show you what's happening on the endpoints there. So that's something pretty excited about, right? So this is happening in real time. I realize this is a virtual machine, set up here in a lab environment, but all of our tests that we've done will show that this process, happens exactly the same no matter, whether it's 50,000 machines or 10, right? It's very, very quick. On that note, while this is finishing, we have made some improvements to not only the inventory collection process, but the way we store that data in the inventory database. Those optimizations have allowed us to make this process happen a lot quicker, okay? If, for example, and we'll see this a little bit later, I went to a task and I decided to run a file scan, for example, that would take some time, obviously, to do that, right? The system will still do it. It's just going to have to wait for that file scan to complete. That could take, 5 minutes, could take 2 days, depending on what it's scanning and what it's looking for and how much data it's going after, okay? So keep that in mind there. Now that this is complete, you can see I've got the feedback here. I'm saying, 8 tasks succeeded. I can go ahead and look at the results. Here you go on the list. Here are all the machines I actually touched. You can see what was actually run. In this case, doing that update also runs a system assessment scan as well, just in case, again, going back to that vulnerability question, maybe you're trying to deploy a patch, right? And this is a security issue. So we'll grab those. You can see what the information is. If anything failed, we'll give you a reason for that. And then, of course, you can drill into these and get some additional information pieces as well. Okay? So let's go back to our kind of our demo process here. We've done our search. We realized that some of those systems weren't as current as we'd like them to be. We brought them up to date, and now we need to go back to what we were doing, okay? So let's go back to my search results here. I want to do another search for Microsoft Office and just see if anything different popped up, okay? In this case, no, everything looks the same, right? But hypothetically, this could have changed, right? Again, Apache servers are a perfect example, right? You may track your Apache servers running on your actual servers, your physical servers, but what about development environments, right? Do you know if somebody has an Apache instance running on a box under their desk or in a VM or something like that as an example, right? Happens all the time, okay? So let's go ahead and select, in this case, our Office Professional 2013. And as I showed you before, you can click on this, right? If you want to see who actually shows up on that list, you can go ahead and do that as well, okay? And then I've got my actions menu available to me here, right? So from here, I can do another inventory update, which I don't need to do, obviously, because I just took care of that a second ago here. I also have the ability to save this as a target. So you may find yourself in a situation where I know there's potentially a problem. I know what criteria I have to look for. I want to go ahead and do that search, build everything I need so I know what I'm looking for, but I don't either have a remediation object yet, or it's not time to remediate this, or even better, maybe I'm not the one doing this. Maybe this is the security team that needs, access to whatever that particular group is, okay? So we can go ahead and save this off. I can save it as, and I'll show you where these live. TCM, MS Office Search, right? Is what would pop up there. Click OK. Done, right? Went ahead and created a target there real quick. And again, that can now go to, maybe the tier 2, right, support team or whoever that is, right? Because you've defined the scope for them and ready to go, okay? Something I was able to do very, very quickly. You may also want to just say, hey, maybe it's the CIO that's coming after you, or the CISO, somebody like that, wondering what your status is with this, WannaCry style outbreak. Well, okay, here are all my Apache systems. Let me go ahead and email the results out to this individual, right? This uses the same mail relay that the notification server does. So whatever settings are in there, that's how this is going to go ahead and, process its email. Type in whatever message you have, and it'll go ahead and shoot a table out that looks pretty similar to what you saw on the results list a little bit earlier. And there you go. You have some information there. It's available to you, right? So again, trying to take some actions there to kind of give you an idea of what's going on, okay? The last thing, and of course you can save as a CSV as well, right? Perhaps you have a third-party system that you're using that's non-Symantec related, right? You need to get these systems out, put them in there, and do something else with them. Totally okay. Save it as a CSV and go from there. In this case, though, we want to go ahead and run a task. Now, this will give you access to any job or task that's published in the Jobs and Task engine that you, being the worker that's logged into this session, if you will, has access to. So if those jobs and tasks have been scoped out for whatever reason, right, then you obviously wouldn't see the ones that you don't have access to as well, okay? But any one of these I can go ahead and click on and go to town on. I created one earlier, which is just a cheeky little command line that runs I think it runs a message box on the endpoint there. But I can do a search for it. Oops. It's not Office, it is, I think it's Office Patch is what I called it. No, maybe not. All right, well, we'll skip that and just pick any old one here. Let's say it was the BCD edit, right? I can go ahead and run that task, which will likely fail because the endpoint doesn't have access to that, but that's okay. And it'll do its thing, right? So again, this job and task that's processing right now, if you have a job that happens to chain software together, for example, and it's doing a complicated install, this thing's gonna spin for a few minutes, right, while it's actually doing that and executing out there. So don't expect it to just be totally instantaneous. It's still kind of dependent on what action is actually being taken at the endpoint level itself. Make sense? Okay. Questions, comments, thoughts, stories, and then I'll talk about a couple other things here shortly. Yeah, let's get you a microphone here. Okay. Yes, so hierarchy aware. Yeah, a question around hierarchy. This TCM interface is attached to each individual notification server. So if you have 10 child notification servers, you would need to run it in 10 different places, right, in order to execute that search. That is something we're aware of, and we will be, at some point, looking into making this hierarchy aware so you could at least say, okay, I want to run this search against these, 9 NSs, for example. But currently, no. It would need to be done individually at each node, if you will. Great question. Anybody else? Yes?
How big of a hit do the endpoints do the scan?
So the question was, how big of a hit do the endpoints take when you do a scan? The inventory process itself, you saw how quick that was. Not a huge hit at all, is actually run. We were doing some wizardry, looking at add remove programs, a couple other things. This also, by the way, is supported on the Mac systems as well. We can do that forced inventory update and bring that data in as well from that perspective. So it's very, very light. When we get into some of the more advanced use cases like deploying patches or pushing pieces of software, then the hit in that case is obviously going to be exponential based on whatever that action is. But as a general rule, WebSocket connection is very low, inventory is very low as well. The inventory should process within 15, 20 seconds at most at each endpoint and report back. So in and out, very quick. Yeah.
Not to mention the bulk. Sorry. Did you mention the bulk where it automatically goes when you select over 500, it will bulk load them in 500 segments?
That's coming up, but thank you.
Okay,
that was a great segue.
Bye-bye now.
Yeah. Yeah, go ahead. Has the ASDK been extended for this? It sure has. We added some ASDK objects for the TCM components, if you will, and those will continue to grow as we add additional feature points to this as well. Yeah, great question. Anybody else? Sure. So the question was around role and scope. Who actually has access to this? So by default, out of the box, any Altiris admin role, if you will, is going to have access to this. Anybody below that, I think there's a level 1 worker and a couple other roles out of the box. They will not. You do have the ability, though, to scope that and add it however you want, right? So you can create new roles, customize that, and control who has access. So you've got two pieces to that pie, if you will. There's access to the TCM interface itself, and then there's the scope in which those individuals or group of individuals have access to XYZ resources, right? Both of those get taken into account, very similar to the way a report would behave, right? If you run a report and only have access to a certain group of resources, that's all you're ever going to be able to see. Yeah. Good? Okay. So before I move on out of this interface, then we'll talk about a couple of the other pieces here. I want to talk about some kind of roadmap options, if you will. I don't want to steal too much thunder from tomorrow, but I guess the first question I have to everybody in the room is Is this valuable, or did we waste our time building something like this? Was this good? Is this good? Is everybody going to use it? Okay, all right. That's what I want to hear. Very nice. Okay. The next question is around extending this out to some of the other pieces of the pie, if you will, within ITMS, right? You've been hearing from us that, security is obviously a theme. We want to target, some of those security resources. Security hygiene is a term you'll hear from us a lot in terms of, how we operate and behave. It's pretty obvious that, the classic IT operations teams, if you will, that exist in the world are still there, but now we've got this security response thing that kind of exists, right? And every single company is a little bit different. Some of these folks, run the place and have, full control over a lot of things. Some of those groups only make policy, right? And the operations teams are the ones that then kind of go enforce that, right? And then you have every, permutation possible kind of in between there. The reality is with these security use cases and even with the security hygiene concept, we're talking about the same thing we've always been talking about, right? That's being able to deploy patches, right? Get up-to-date inventory, do all those different things that we normally would. So for us, this is a natural extension into being able to do those things, but also be able to do them in real time, like a break glass in case of emergency. So the next evolution of this that you'll see as we go forward is the ability to, on the actions menu, say, okay, I found what I'm looking for here. Now I want to deploy software to this, right? Because another example of this would be, let's say I'm a level 1 help desk worker and I just want to be able to push some software out, but I need to do a search, first or something like that, right? I'd be able to do that here, right? As an admin. What if you, in that WannaCry example that we were talking about, what if I had a patch available already in the software catalog? Or what if that patch was available in the patch catalog, if you will? Wouldn't it be great if I could just say, okay, here's my scope. I found all my Apache systems. Now I want to take this patch and I need to deploy that right now, right? And break glass in case of emergency, if you will. Does that make sense? That's the direction we're headed in, is to be able to do that. We don't want to replace the way you traditionally do things. The traditional patch hygiene, and software catalog, that all makes sense, right? I mean, as I mentioned, 99% of the time, 95% of the time, that's the right way to do things. But there are certain situations where you need to get things done right away. And so being able to kind of morph this and add some pieces into it are, where we want to go with that, okay? Any thoughts on that? Anything else? Okay, all right. So let's switch gears here for a quick second and talk about, let's see if I can get out of this here. Go back to the deck here for a moment. All right. So now let's go back to some of the architectural pieces, right? So and this is still true in 8.5, right? So what we're talking about right now is from a communication point of view, if you're not using that WebSocket connection, what are some of the challenges that you kind of are looking at, right? Why did we go down this road here? The existing client in its traditional nature is a little chatty, right? By design. I mean, that's kind of how it has to work, right? So it's going to send some pings out here and there to make sure that the notification server is there. It's going to do that in order to see if there are any new policies that require any check-in, things like that, right? All of those HTTP requests that get sent as well, or HTTPS, right? Each service layer, and I'm dumbing this down a little bit just for the sake of conversation here, kind of has its own little connection that it has to open to say, is there a software policy? Is there this? Is there that? And so on and so forth, right? With the WebSockets, we're able to tunnel that and get rid of all those different requests, right? So that's how the overhead gets reduced, and that's why we think you'll actually see less traffic, if you will, on those endpoints going on there, right? And then, of course, every single action or event or connection, whatever you want to call it there, that the notification server gets is going to cause overhead, right? It's got to get processed. It's got to load up in memory, so on and so forth. So if we reduce those, naturally, we're reducing the overhead on the notification server itself, okay? The other one was the big limitation with the task infrastructure, okay? If I have a cloud-enabled management gateway set up right now, and I've got 10,000 resources that are sitting out on the internet, I have no real way of managing them directly. The gateway is great because the gateway acts as a proxy and gives me the ability to at least have a public check-in point, if you will, for those endpoints to be able to dock to and see if a policy is available. But let's go back to this WannaCry example right here, and let's say there is an outbreak. I need to push this out to my devs who happen to work from home, right? Maybe they're contractors, right? And they've all got Apache servers all over the place. Well, now I'm in a situation where I have to wait, potentially, right? And that could be quite a while. And even if I use the task infrastructure to say, do this right now, force it, that task connection is still relying on a check-in because of all the ports required, right, for the task services. I mean, you guys are all familiar with how that works, right? This is no longer the case if we use that WebSocket approach, okay? There's also, of course, the obvious latency, right? Because we're checking in, takes time. Could take, however long, right? And most of us want to say, let's put a 5-minute check-in policy in. We all know what happens, when you play that game, right? It doesn't always work the way you want it to, right? So your options today, and we do have some customers doing this, they have multiple communication profiles, multiple agent connection profiles, right, that all have different aggressive settings depending on what you're trying to do, right? But as we know, one size never fits all, and so you're in a situation where these folks that I have a policy that lets me talk to them right away may not necessarily be part of the group that I need to attach to, and anyway, it just gets very confusing, right? So by switching that over to the WebSocket side, we're able to do that, a lot easier, right? So server-side changes, right? Most of this is stuff that, to be quite frank, most of you probably won't care about, but just to kind of give you an idea of what's really happening under the covers there, we actually created a WebSocket server, so that's the service, if you will, that runs on the management server itself. That is what manages all those docked connections and, essentially, juggles all the traffic and so on and so forth, right? It's something that's embedded into IIS there. It does run on HTTPS, and it does use an SSL certificate, okay? So keep that in mind, right? All those, like I mentioned, need to be set up. So this is very secure. In fact, one would argue that your security teams would actually prefer this over the classic methodology of communication, just given the way it actually behaves there, okay? As I mentioned too, supported on 2012 and 2016, so 2008 is out due to the lack of WebSocket support on IIS, okay? And that's one of the reasons 8.5 is only supported on 2012 and 2016. So if you're on 2008 still, for some reason, and you're on, say, 8.1, you are going to need to upgrade that infrastructure in order to migrate to 8.5, okay? Just keep that in mind there. All right. As I mentioned, the TCM communication itself, the policies as we saw, those are disabled by default, so nobody needs to panic that upgrading to 8.5 is all of a sudden going to turn on all these persistent connections. It's not going to happen out of the box. We'll give you a couple of versions before we do that to you. I'm just kidding. We won't turn it on by default. We did add a targeting mechanism for the connection profiles, and then there is an additional ability there to create an installation package from the profiles as well in the event you want to create an agent installation package that's already kind of TCM enabled, right? With that communication profile, that's something you can do there. So just kind of nickel and dime stuff, all right? Now on the agent side, similar improvements were made, right? The actual client itself has some DLLs that are in there that allow it to, process those WebSocket connections and actually manage that that process, if you will. On the it's supported on Windows 7 and above. That's the same caveat that Server 2008 had. Anything below Windows 7 just doesn't support the technology, right? So that's just kind of where you're at with that. I know a few of you probably have some, Windows 98 boxes floating around. I'm poking fun at some folks I was talking to a little bit earlier there. Some folks, legitimately will have, XP devices floating around and things like that. That's okay. You just won't be able to take advantage of this technology in those situations, okay? In the event that WebSocket is not available for some reason, the agent will just fall back to classic communication. So it's not a one or the other. It's a primary becomes that SSL persistent connection. If for whatever reason that becomes unavailable, it just goes back to the normal way of doing business like it normally would, okay? All right. The software portal has been modified a little bit as well to support that. So because these WebSockets are available through the cloud gateway, we had to modify the portal to be able to support that. So if you open up the portal from the gateway using a WebSocket, right, we're going to interpret that and use it the right way there, okay? I'll talk a little bit about how some of the communication works here with that here in just a couple of minutes there. And then, of course, the core agent, right, has a bunch of improvements and things like that built into it to be able to handle all these different pieces. You will notice in the actual agent settings itself, if you crack that open, there is a server connection block that exists now that will show you persistent, meaning it's actually docked with that SSL, WebSocket, or non-persistent, meaning it's just connected the way it normally was before, right? And then you'll still see the HTTP or HTTPS flags that existed before. Okay, so not a whole lot of visual changes. For the most part, this should be very transparent to the way you normally, operate, if you will. An added bonus to this, if I go back to the demo here. Oops, not putty. We don't want that. If I jump back in here, and Brian mentioned this a little bit, but if I go to Manage Policies, because we have this WebSocket connection available to us, I can actually take any policy that exists, right-click on it, and I have the option to push the policy down to the endpoint now. So think about that for a minute, right? Patch policies, create them all the time, right? Then we sit and wait for however long it takes for all the math to resolve and all the nonsense to happen. Which again, like I said, if you're not patching till Friday, who cares, right? Let the math happen. If I need this to go out right now, though, I want to push that policy out right now. This is a way for me to kind of force the process to occur, right? The STS assessment scan is still going to happen. The package still has to get downloaded. All the stuff that normally happens still happens normally, but the agent will get the policy right now and start that process right now. So if you are like most customers and you have a 4-hour check-in window, an 8-hour check-in window, some of you only check in once a day in some cases because of the way your network is distributed, right? If you have a situation where you need to push something out right away, this is a way to do that, right? So we'll start to evolve a bit more as well and, help kind of force feed some of those processes to occur even quicker as we, evolve this feature as well. Okay? All right. So let's jump into the last couple oh, yeah, go ahead.
With that, does it still abide the compliance and remediation that you said?
So the question was, with that push, does it still abide by the same compliance remediation pieces? What context are you talking about there? Give me an example.
When you set the compliance check, I should say.
Oh, yes, yeah. The compliance check time, yeah, exactly. So in the case of like a software deployment, right? That software deployment says, hey, I want you to get this policy right now. Run, tell me whether or not you're violating compliance, right? Does it exist? Does it not? But I don't want you to run compliance until tonight, and then I don't want you to remediate until Thursday, for example. All of that, exactly the way it was normally. All this is doing is taking that policy, and instead of waiting for the client to check in to download it, it just says, take this policy right now and process it. So in your case, and in that example, pushing it would do nothing. It wouldn't help you in any way, shape, or form, right? But if that compliance check was set to happen now, and remediation was set to happen now, and you didn't want to wait, potentially 12 hours for that thing to check in, if that was where the numbers were, this would dramatically improve that speed selectively, right? You wouldn't have to worry about creating another communication profile, updating it, setting it to 1 minute so the thing aggressively checks in and does what it needs to, and then setting it back as an example. It's a trick some folks use. Okay, good question. All right, back to the PowerPoint here. Okay, so we talked about this. Next, let's talk about the gateway for a minute, okay? So because of this fun little adventure we went on in designing this WebSocket framework, we mandatorily decided that we needed the gateway to support this, right? All this internal stuff is really cool, but one of the advantages we have, quite frankly, over quite a few vendors in the market is our ability to have this cloud-enabled management gateway. Everybody kind of has a response to this in some way, some form or another, right? The technologies exist. There's nothing necessarily special about that. But ours is very easy to use. It's very lightweight. It's very straightforward, right? And it just works the way it needs to, okay? Problem is, it was built on an Apache framework, right? Apache doesn't support that WebSocket connection, at least the iteration that we were using there, okay? The Apache instance was also limited to, Tomas, correct me here, I want to say it was about 3,000, 3 to 5, wasn't it, connections? Yeah, active connections at any given time. So scalability became a bit of an issue, right? If you were a large organization that had a lot of remote workers, you needed a lot of gateways, okay? Well, we rebuilt it. And this time we decided to build it on the open source cross-platform .NET framework. And if you're not familiar with what this is, Microsoft has taken the .NET framework, which is obviously a Windows-style framework implementation, and they've turned it into kind of this open source model. So there's two flavors of it, if you will. There's the full Windows version of it that supports 80 billion different iterations. But then there's this cross-platform one that'll run on Linux, it'll run on Mac devices, it'll run on anything, right? And it gives you access to all those different programmatic options there, okay? We built the gateway on top of that, all right? That gateway still runs on Windows in this case, right? So it's a Windows server that you would run it on. The connections that it supports are upwards of 20,000 per gateway, at least. In fact, we think it's probably closer to 40 or 50 at that point per gateway, okay? And in the future, should we go down this road, it's something we're kind of investigating right now, is we could actually port this thing over to a Linux server, for example, if we wanted to, and turn this into a virtual appliance. There's absolutely no reason why the code wouldn't run in that type of environment. It's perfectly legitimate and ready to go. So it's just a question of whether or not we ever get to that point. I know Windows servers aren't necessarily the end of the world, but there's obviously a licensing cost, associated with having a Windows server. Some folks would prefer to have, some type of a Linux, style setup or a Linux appliance, as something to be available. And just out of curiosity, while we're on topic, anybody would prefer having something like that, deploying either a virtual appliance or even just managing their own version of Linux or Unix in the DMZ for something like this, just show of hands. Okay, a few of you. No, and that's fair, absolutely fair, okay? Additionally there, because it's built on that .NET stack, we've added some improvements to the management functionality. There's some performance counters that are available as well that we didn't have access to before. Some of the reporting's a lot better, right? It's a little bit easier to manipulate there. The installation of this is an in-place migration. So you take the new gateway package, you run it, it'll transfer all the settings, all the certificates over, and it just transparently upgrades itself and it's ready to go, okay? No new ports required, nothing weird going on there. You do have some additional options now of pointing an individual gateway at multiple notification servers, where before it was a single notification server but multiple site servers. So you can really kind of get a mesh network set up with these. And that's about it, right? I mean, there's a few little caveats here and there. We've got some white papers on it, but for the most part, this is a much needed improvement over, from a scalability perspective, over the way the existing gateway itself actually behaves there. So, any questions, thoughts, concerns?
Rob, you pulled out 2008 server support under TCM, but on the IG side, you're still supporting 2008 updates, is that correct?
We are, yeah, and that's something I need to look into. I don't know if that's a typo. I got to go back and double check that. But the 2008 will work for the gateway. It will not work for the WebSocket portion of the gateway, if that makes sense. That's the issue there. So if the WebSockets are not concern to you, then 2008 is perfectly okay to deploy and go from there. But that's really the caveat there. Okay? All right. Any other thoughts? Good? Okay. Well, that about covers it for the time critical management pieces. As I mentioned, there's a pretty healthy roadmap that we have. We're pretty excited about this feature and what kind of doors it opens, if you will, what opportunities we have going forward into the future there. So expect to see a lot more from us. Release update 1 is scheduled for kind of end of this year, early next year for the 8.5, and then subsequent RUs are going to have some goodies in it that are attached to this piece. So really appreciate everybody's time on this one, and if that's it, we'll switch gears and jump to the next presentation. Sound good? Awesome. All right.
To learn more, visit go.symantec.com/manage.